At dawn, frost clung to roadside grass, where a county worker noticed a parked sedan dusted with ice, its driver door ajar, engine cold, radio silent, and a purse resting on the seat, signaling to responding deputies that December had preserved something terribly unfinished beneath the quiet Virginia sky above. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The car sat just off Route 613 outside the town of Ashford, Virginia, a place of 2 stoplights, shuttered mills, and courthouse records that smelled faintly of paper and dust. The date was December 14, 1994. Christmas decorations were already strung along Main Street, plastic wreaths taped to storefront windows, a seasonal cheer that felt abruptly out of place as deputies documented the scene. The registered owner of the vehicle was 22-year-old Laura Ann Mercer, a community college student who lived 10 miles away and had been reported missing by her mother the previous evening when she failed to return home after work. There was no sign of forced damage to the car. The gas tank was half full. The keys were missing. The purse contained cash, identification, and a folded receipt from a grocery store dated that afternoon, placing Laura alive only hours earlier. The initial search widened quickly, methodical, and restrained. State police were notified. A perimeter was established, measured in cold footsteps and flagging tape that snapped in the wind. The nearby creek was checked, its banks rimmed with ice, water running dark and fast from recent snowmelt. Volunteers arrived as daylight strengthened, moving in quiet lines through bare trees, their breath visible, boots crunching leaves hardened by frost. By mid-afternoon, a K-9 unit traced a scent from the car toward a narrow access road leading into state land used for hunting. The trail faded where gravel met asphalt. There was no dramatic discovery that day, only the steady accumulation of absence. Laura Mercer had grown up in Ashford, graduated from the local high school, and worked part-time at a hardware store while taking classes in accounting. She was known for punctuality, routine, and an unremarkable kindness that rarely draws headlines. On December evenings, she typically drove straight home, stopping occasionally at the same grocery store. Thanksgiving had passed quietly with family. Plans for Christmas were modest. Her disappearance did not fit a pattern of risk-taking or conflict. Investigators noted this carefully, building a baseline from which any deviation would matter. Within 48 hours, the search turned grim. On December 16, a hunter walking private land less than 2 miles from the abandoned vehicle found a disturbed area near a tree line. Deputies secured the site. Laura Mercer was located there, concealed by brush and early snow. There were no signs of prolonged struggle at the scene. The cold had slowed decomposition, preserving details that would later become crucial. The body was transported to the medical examiner's office in Richmond for autopsy, while Ashford returned to its routines under a lowered voice. The autopsy established cause of death as manual strangulation, estimated to have occurred the night of December 14. There were no defensive wounds suggesting a prolonged fight and no evidence of sexual assault. Toxicology was negative. Fingernail scrapings were collected. Fibers were preserved. The findings suggested a controlled encounter, brief and lethal, likely involving someone Laura knew or trusted enough to approach. The absence of chaos was itself evidence. Investigators recorded it without speculation. Media coverage followed the familiar arc of local tragedy. The Ashford Herald ran a front-page photograph of Laura's senior portrait beside a Christmas border. A candlelight vigil gathered on the courthouse steps, hymn voices thin in the cold. Tips came in steadily at first, then slowed. Police reconstructed Laura's final day through receipts, time cards, and witness statements. She left work at 6, 05 p.m., stopped at the grocery store at 6:27 and was last seen exiting at 6:41. Her car was discovered before dawn. Somewhere between those times, she vanished from the ordinary map of her life. Detectives examined acquaintances and routines, documenting names in binders that would later be stored in a basement archive. A former boyfriend was interviewed and cleared by alibi. Coworkers were questioned, then questioned again months later as memory dulled. A truck seen idling near the grocery store became a lead, then dissolved when its owner produced receipts placing him miles away. The investigation remained active through the winter, through Christmas and New Year's, through a town's quiet reckoning with fear. Then, gradually, attention drifted. New cases arrived. Files were boxed. Laura Mercer's case slipped into the cold category by the summer of 1996, unsolved but not forgotten, waiting in paper and evidence for a future that had not yet arrived. As winter loosened its grip on Ashford in early 1995, the Mercer file remained active in theory, if not in daily practice. Detectives revisited the physical evidence with an eye trained on restraint rather than urgency, cataloging fibers, documenting the absence of prints, noting the limitations imposed by cold exposure. Fingernail scrapings yielded partial biological material insufficient for comparison under the standards of the time. A single dark fiber recovered from Laura Mercer's coat was traced to a common automotive upholstery blend, widely used and not traceable to a specific manufacturer. Nothing pointed cleanly outward. The timeline reconstruction became the spine of the investigation. Laura's route home from the grocery store was straightforward, a familiar two-lane stretch bordered by pines and seasonal creeks. There were no reported traffic incidents that night. Weather records showed temperatures dropping below freezing shortly after sunset, with no precipitation. The road conditions were clear. Investigators theorized an interception close to the store or along the first mile of her drive, where lighting thinned and shoulders widened enough for a brief stop. No surveillance cameras existed in Ashford in 1994, and the grocery store's exterior lights cast only a shallow pool. Witness recollections, gathered weeks later, placed nothing unusual there. Attention shifted to the access road where Laura's body was found. The land was a patchwork of public and private parcels, used by hunters and locals who knew the trails by habit. Tire impressions were indistinct, frozen and refrozen. Boot prints overlapped with those of searchers. A methodical review of hunting permits produced dozens of names, none immediately actionable. The medical examiner's estimate placed death within hours of disappearance, supporting the notion of a short transport and a nearby offender. That conclusion narrowed geography but not identity. The case took on the slow rhythm familiar to small departments. Detectives rotated assignments. Notes were updated in longhand. The Ashford Herald printed occasional reminders, usually around holidays, when absence is felt more sharply. Each Thanksgiving and Christmas, Laura Mercer's name returned to the page beside appeals for information. Each year, fewer tips arrived. In 1998, the Virginia State Police Cold Case Unit conducted a review. Advances in forensic science were modest but growing. Evidence was re-examined, photographed anew, and preserved with updated protocols. The partial biological material from fingernail scrapings was deemed insufficient for then-current DNA typing, but it was retained, carefully sealed and logged for future testing. This decision, routine and quiet, would later prove decisive. Interviews were refreshed. One name reappeared with a subtle insistence. Daniel Price, then 31, lived less than a mile from the access road in 1994. He had been interviewed early and dismissed after stating he had been home that evening. No one had contradicted him. He worked seasonal construction, moved frequently, and had no criminal record at the time. His connection was geographic rather than personal. He did not know Laura Mercer, according to available records. Yet his name surfaced again when a retired deputy recalled a minor complaint involving Price and a woman at a gas station months before the murder, resolved without charges. The memory was imprecise, the paperwork thin. It was noted and filed. Years passed. The town changed gradually. The hardware store closed. The grocery store expanded and installed cameras in the early 2000s. Laura Mercer's parents aged into a quieter grief. The case remained open, its evidence preserved in a locked room, its details maintained by habit and professional respect. In 2014, a grant-funded initiative allowed the Cold Case Unit to submit previously untestable biological samples for advanced DNA analysis. The fingernail scrapings from Laura Mercer's case were among them. The material yielded a partial male profile, incomplete but viable for database comparison. It did not match anyone in CODIS at the time. The profile was uploaded, flagged, and watched. 2 years later, in 2016, a hit arrived quietly. Daniel Price, now in his early 50s, had been arrested in another county for an unrelated assault involving strangulation. The victim survived. Price's DNA was collected as part of booking procedures and entered into the system. The partial profile from 1994 showed a consistent match across multiple loci. The probability was significant enough to warrant immediate action. Investigators moved carefully. A match was an invitation, not a conclusion. They reopened the Mercer file fully, reconstructing Price's movements in December 1994. Employment records placed him off work that week. Utility bills confirmed his residence near the access road at the time. Witnesses from decades earlier were recontacted, their memories thin but occasionally corroborative. One former neighbor recalled seeing Laura's car on the roadside the night it disappeared, lights off, another vehicle idling nearby. The recollection had not surfaced before. It was documented, contextualized, and weighed. A search warrant was obtained for Price's current residence. Items were collected for comparison, including old clothing stored in boxes. A fiber consistent with the dark upholstery blend recovered from Laura's coat was identified in a vehicle Price owned in the 1990s, confirmed through registration records. The fiber alone proved nothing. Combined with DNA, geography, and pattern, it added weight. Price was interviewed in 2017. He denied involvement, offered shifting accounts of his whereabouts, and failed to explain inconsistencies in his earlier statements. Confronted with forensic findings, he requested counsel. The interview ended without confession, as many do. The case advanced regardless, built on evidence rather than admission, moving toward a courtroom where time would be measured not in seasons but in records, testimony, and the quiet endurance of proof. The reopening of the Mercer case moved forward with a discipline shaped by decades of mischances. Detectives treated every step as if it would be tested years later, because it would. Old notebooks were scanned and indexed. Evidence logs were reconciled against storage records. Chain of custody was rebuilt line by line, confirming that each item had remained sealed, labeled, and accounted for since 1994. This work lacked drama, but it formed the foundation upon which everything else would rest. Daniel Price's life between 1994 and 2016 was reconstructed through public records, employment files, and routine interviews. He had drifted through counties, taken seasonal work, and maintained few long-term relationships. There were no previous homicide charges, no early markers that would have drawn sustained attention. Yet the 2016 assault case revealed a behavioral consistency investigators could not ignore. The method described by the surviving victim aligned with the autopsy findings from Laura Mercer's death, not in detail but in approach, control, and proximity. The similarity was noted cautiously, never overstated. Prosecutors were consulted early. The Commonwealth's attorney for the circuit insisted on a conservative path, one that avoided speculation, and relied only on evidence that could be explained cleanly to a jury. The partial DNA profile was strengthened through additional testing, increasing the number of matching loci and reducing the probability of coincidence. Expert reports were prepared to explain the limitations and strengths of partial profiles, anticipating challenges rooted in the age of the evidence. Investigators returned to Ashford with fresh purpose. They walked the access road again, this time with digital mapping tools unavailable in the 90s. Distances were measured precisely. Sightlines were calculated for December light conditions. The route from the grocery store to the roadside turnout was timed at normal speed. Nothing was assumed. Everything was documented. Witness outreach resumed, this time framed by specificity rather than general appeal. The former neighbor's recollection of a second vehicle was corroborated by a service record placing Price's truck on the road that week, its distinctive exhaust noted in maintenance notes. A retired store clerk recalled a man lingering near the entrance that evening, a memory sharpened by photographs shown during a carefully conducted interview. The clerk could not identify Price with certainty, and that uncertainty was preserved in the report. Investigators resisted the temptation to close gaps with confidence. Media attention returned, measured and restrained. The Ashford Herald published an update describing renewed forensic testing without naming a suspect. The tone reflected the town's maturity, less alarm than patience. Laura Mercer's parents declined interviews, choosing privacy after years of public hope. Their absence from the page was itself a statement, one understood by readers who had watched time pass. In 2018, a grand jury convened to review the evidence. Testimony was limited to essentials. Forensic experts explained the DNA match. Detectives outlined the timeline and geography. The fiber analysis was presented as corroborative, not definitive. The assault case was mentioned only to establish identity and opportunity for DNA collection, not to suggest propensity. The grand jury returned an indictment for second-degree murder. Daniel Price was arrested quietly at his residence, without incident, and transported to the county jail. The arrest rippled through Ashford with a muted shock. Price had never been a fixture in town life, yet his proximity to the case unsettled residents who measured safety by familiarity. Christmas approached again. Lights hung along Main Street as they had every year since 1994. This time, the decorations shared space with a restrained sense of reckoning. Pretrial motions consumed months. The defense challenged the DNA evidence, the delay in prosecution, and the reliability of memory after decades. Each motion was answered with records, logs, and expert affidavits. The court ruled consistently in favor of admissibility, citing the preservation of evidence and the absence of investigative misconduct. The case moved toward trial with the slow certainty of process. Jury selection began in the fall of 2019. Prospective jurors were questioned about their exposure to the case and their ability to weigh old evidence without prejudice. Those with fixed opinions were excused. The panel ultimately seated reflected the county's demographics, including men and women old enough to remember 1994 as lived time rather than history. Their presence mattered. The trial unfolded without theatrics. The prosecution presented the timeline first, grounding the narrative in receipts, time cards, and weather reports. The discovery of the abandoned car was described with care, avoiding dramatization. Forensic testimony followed, precise and limited. The DNA match was explained in plain terms, probabilities contextualized, margins acknowledged. The defense cross-examined vigorously, highlighting gaps and the absence of confession. The fiber evidence was debated, its commonality emphasized. Throughout, the judge maintained a steady hand, sustaining objections where appropriate and reminding counsel of scope. There were no outbursts, no moments designed for headlines. The courtroom reflected the tone of the case itself, serious and restrained. Closing arguments returned to fundamentals. The prosecution argued convergence rather than certainty in isolation, urging the jury to consider how independent lines of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The defense argued reasonable doubt born of time, suggesting that the past could not be reconstructed with the clarity demanded by law. The jury retired to deliberate as winter approached again, carrying with them decades of waiting compressed into a quiet room where the clock marked not years, but minutes. Deliberations lasted 2 days, extending through a weekend when frost returned to Ashford, and the courthouse steps gathered a thin skin of ice each morning. Jurors reviewed exhibits carefully, requesting readbacks of forensic testimony and clarification on probability language. They asked to see the chain of custody logs again, paging through decades of signatures and dates that testified to patience more than urgency. No notes from deliberations reached the outside world. The town waited with a familiarity, earned through long winters and slower news cycles. On the third morning, the jury returned. Daniel Price stood without expression as the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder. The words landed quietly, without reaction from the gallery. Laura Mercer's parents were not present. They had been informed they would receive notice of the outcome and chose not to sit through the reading. Their decision reflected a private boundary drawn after 25 years of attention and restraint. Sentencing was scheduled for early January 2020. A pre-sentence investigation documented Price's history, noting the absence of prior violent convictions before the 2016 assault and the pattern of transient work and residence. Impact statements were submitted in writing. The court reviewed them without public reading, respecting the family's request for minimal spectacle. At sentencing, the judge cited the deliberateness of the crime, the abuse of trust implied by proximity, and the enduring harm caused by evasion. Daniel Price received a sentence of 40 years in state prison, with credit for time served. He was remanded immediately. The legal process did not end with sentencing. Appeals were filed as a matter of course, challenging evidentiary rulings and the sufficiency of the DNA match. Each appeal was denied in turn, appellate courts affirming the trial court's careful adherence to procedure and the jury's role in weighing evidence. By late 2021, the conviction stood final. For Ashford, the resolution brought a subdued closure rather than relief. There were no celebrations, no sense of victory. The hardware store remained closed. The grocery store's cameras now watched a brighter parking lot. The access road near the state land was still used by hunters, its surface regraded, its past absorbed into ordinary use. A small memorial marker, placed privately by the Mercer family on permitted land, bore Laura's name and dates without commentary. The Mercer file was archived again, this time with a different designation. Solved. The binder that once held unanswered questions now included verdict forms, appellate opinions, and a final summary prepared by the cold case unit. It described the case in measured terms, emphasizing evidence preservation, advances in forensic science, and the necessity of patience. The summary avoided triumphal language. It read like a lesson rather than a story. Investigators who had carried the case over years retired one by one. Some attended a brief internal debriefing, where the Mercer case was discussed as an example of what careful record-keeping can accomplish long after initial momentum fades. Younger detectives listened, aware that their own cases might someday depend on decisions made without expectation of recognition. Media coverage tapered off. The Ashford Herald ran a final piece after the appeals concluded, focusing on the endurance of the family and the importance of forensic preservation. It did not include photographs. The tone matched the town's temperament, acknowledging closure without reopening wounds. Each December thereafter, the season returned as it always had, with lights on Main Street and wreaths on doors. For those who remembered 1994, the month carried an added weight, now shaped by an ending as well as a beginning. The case no longer hovered as an open question. It settled into memory with defined edges. Daniel Price entered the state correctional system at an age when years are measured differently. His projected release date placed him beyond the span of active middle age. He did not offer a public statement, nor did he confess. The legal outcome did not require one. Responsibility had been established through evidence and process rather than words. Laura Mercer's name appeared less frequently over time, as names do. It remained in court records, in the cold case unit's annual report, and in the private recollections of those who had known her briefly or only through newsprint. The resolution did not restore what was lost. It clarified what had happened and who was accountable, within the limits of law and time. The case stood as an example of how ordinary places hold extraordinary truths beneath routine surfaces. A parked car at dawn, a receipt folded in a purse, a decision to preserve evidence that could not yet speak. Decades later, those elements aligned. The outcome did not erase the years of uncertainty, but it placed them within a narrative that could finally end. As winter settled again over Virginia, the Mercer case closed quietly. Its final chapter written not in headlines but in files returned to shelves. Lights turned off in offices, and a town that moved forward carrying the knowledge that patience, when paired with care, can eventually give voice to the past without raising it into spectacle. The final stage of the Mercer case unfolded not with urgency, but with a careful accounting of what closure means after time has done its work. In early 2022, the Cold Case Unit completed its administrative review, documenting lessons learned and confirming that all physical evidence would remain preserved according to statute, even after conviction. This decision reflected a professional humility shaped by experience, acknowledging that justice is strengthened when systems remain open to scrutiny long after verdicts are read. Ashford's courthouse returned to its familiar rhythm. Property disputes, probate filings, and traffic dockets replaced the quiet gravity that had filled the building during trial. The Mercer name receded from daily conversation, surfacing only when records were requested or anniversaries approached. For many residents, the case became a marker in personal timelines, remembered in relation to marriages, retirements, and moves away from town. It existed less as a story than as a reference point, a reminder of how ordinary life can fracture without warning. Law enforcement agencies across Virginia cited the case in training materials, emphasizing the value of preserving marginal evidence and documenting early interviews without assumptions. The partial DNA profile, once considered insufficient, became a teaching example of why restraint matters. Investigators who had sealed those samples in the late 90s did so without expectation of recognition. Their work gained meaning only decades later, when technology caught up to patience. The Mercer family maintained privacy. They acknowledged the outcome through a brief written statement submitted to the court, expressing gratitude for persistence and asking for space to continue living quietly. There were no public appearances, no interviews revisiting loss. Their approach reflected an understanding that resolution does not restore the past but can stabilize the present. The marker they placed near the permitted edge of the state land remained modest, visited occasionally, tended without ceremony. Each holiday season, Ashford prepared as it always had. Thanksgiving parades passed down Main Street, smaller than in earlier years but still earnest. Christmas lights illuminated storefronts, some new, some repaired and reused. For those who remembered December 1994, the decorations carried layered meanings. The month that once signaled uncertainty now also marked the completion of a long process, one measured not in celebration but in relief from unanswered questions. Daniel Price's incarceration followed established routines. Intake assessments, classification and placement occurred without incident. His appeals exhausted, he entered a phase of confinement defined by regulation rather than attention. The correctional record reflected compliance without distinction. The absence of confession remained a fact, neither mitigating nor aggravating within the framework of law. Accountability had been assigned through evidence, not admission. The Mercer case continued to appear in academic discussions of cold case resolution, cited for its procedural clarity rather than dramatic turns. Scholars noted the convergence of geography, forensic preservation, and cautious prosecutorial strategy. The case illustrated how restraint can coexist with determination, producing outcomes that withstand review. It offered a counterpoint to narratives that favor speed over accuracy. In Ashford, the access road near the state land was repaved in 2023. The work crews found nothing beneath the surface, no remnants or markers. The road returned to use, its past absorbed into the ordinary passage of vehicles and seasons. The place remained what it had always been, altered not by appearance but by memory. As years passed, new residents arrived without personal knowledge of the case. They learned of it indirectly, through records or brief mentions, absorbing it as local history rather than lived experience. This transition marked a quiet success of resolution, allowing a community to move forward without erasing what occurred. The story remained available without dominating the present. The Cold Case Unit archived its final report with a concluding note emphasizing continuity. Cases end, systems persist. The note underscored the responsibility of institutions to outlast individuals, preserving truth until it can be recognized. This perspective framed the Mercer case not as an exception, but as a confirmation of process working as intended, albeit slowly. Laura Mercer's life, described in early reports through dates and routines, remained larger than the circumstances of her death. Friends remembered her punctuality, her plans, her unremarkable kindness. These recollections existed outside the record, carried privately rather than published. The case resolution allowed those memories to stand without the constant pull of uncertainty. By the time the final appeal deadlines passed, winter had returned again. Frost settled on roadside grass at dawn, much as it had decades earlier. The similarity did not signal repetition but continuity, a reminder that seasons proceed regardless of human timelines. What changed was understanding. The unanswered had been answered. The unknown had been named. The Mercer case concluded without spectacle, its finality marked by paperwork completed and files returned to shelves. This ending aligned with the tone of the investigation itself, which had favored method over momentum and evidence over inference. The result was a resolution that could be accepted without reservation, supported by law and process rather than emotion. In the quiet aftermath, Ashford continued, carrying the case as part of its history rather than its identity. The town's roads, records, and routines persisted, shaped by time and weather. The Mercer name remained present but no longer unresolved. The case stood finished, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had finally been understood, allowing those who remained to move forward with clarity earned through patience and care.